All right, for more on this, let's now welcome Standard Bank Chief Economist, Mr. Goolam Ballim. Goolam, such a pleasure having you with us on the show. Good afternoon. So your expectations of the summit. South Africa currently suffering a lot of challenges, from climate change related issues to the day-to-day unemployment issues. What are you hoping Team South Africa is going to highlight as some of the necessary issues that needs focus at this particular summit?
I suspect the summit will grapple with three themes. I think one of them will certainly be poverty and generally unemployment and hardship. The second theme will be climate, quite obviously. And the third will be international governance. So with respect to, for example, poverty, one must all recognize, even though India hosted the summit in 2023, Brazil this year, and South Africa next year, I think it's welcome that these three so-called emerging markets, where there is still a great deal of catch-up in terms of economic and social well-being, that poverty and accessing, for example, international developed markets with regard to exports remains a significant feature. Of course, climate change is important, particularly because developed markets are increasingly seeking to place perhaps a disproportionate burden on emerging and lesser developed countries in terms of emissions containment. And I think there is an injustice in this respect, and therefore the just transition kicks in. Generally speaking, though, the quantum of funding that is required for renewable energy is well short of what is required, and the onus being placed on emerging and lesser developed countries continues to be excessive. So these themes, which are also being discussed or has been discussed at COP29, will be an indelible feature of the G20. And then the last thing just to mention is global governance, the institutions which seemingly set the rules of the global game. These rules seem to be hemorrhaging. It seems the developed world is not subscribing to these rules, or they are forging new rules, particularly given the insecurities with respect to developed markets authority and the ascendancy of South chords, or even just language such as the Global South, which signals greater voice with regard to emerging markets and lesser developed countries.
Absolutely, Goolam, and I'm glad that you mentioned the upcoming COP29 as well, because as we understand, this is actually a perfect timing for Team South Africa, Goolam, as we are also currently grappling with the effects of climate change. And we have been focusing this week on our programs on the current water woes and, of course, how it seems that we often caught napping in terms of mitigating all the potential threats and risks to our economy, as we saw with the load shedding crisis.
No, look, so many countries on the continent, and particularly those in southern Africa, are water scarce. Of course, the Sahara and the Sahel, being largely desert terrain, struggle too, and nations on the fringes of those particular geographies also struggle. And in fact, you could argue Africa's rain belt stretches from the southern Western Sahara through to Ghana, Nigeria, into the DRC, and all the way to Madagascar, for that matter. And because of water scarcity generally, because some of the nations that are most affected by climate change anywhere in the world, such as Mozambique, these matters at COP29 will feature to the extent that in terms of mitigation and adaptation, there needs to be a greater financial support for African markets and other emerging markets, for instance.
And then in terms of the fact that next year it's our turn to actually be presiding over this summit, what do you expect to see then, Goolam?
I suspect that the threads that emerge out of Brazil's presidency of the G20 will spill over into the South Africa presidency. However, I suspect that there will be a greater African flavor, meaning African issues, and also South Africa leading the charge on these matters that we've discussed, for example, but with a greater sense of giving broader African continental representation. As I've suggested, Africa is power shy. It is water challenged in that respect. It lacks international supply chain participation. Yet there are these astronomical demands on African markets, one with respect to climate, two, also with respect to South African markets being shielded from entering developed markets historically, particularly with regard to agriculture, and even new non-tariff barriers under the guise of protecting the climate, under the guise of suppressing production that is hydrocarbons dependent. These things will be grappled with, I suspect, and asserted on behalf of the continent by South Africa for an equitable level of equilibrium, an equitable level of solution finding.
Absolutely, Goolam. We understand also that Dirk actually appointed a prominent think tank to lead the T20 during, of course, this very topic that we're talking about, the T20 during South Africa's G20 presidency. So quite a lot to see there. And I see, Chief, amongst some of the agendas there is the issue on foreign policy as well. Goolam, thank you so much for your input this afternoon. That is Mr. Goolam Ballim, Standard Bank Chief Economist on G20.